boy, girl, boy, girl. Wonderful presentation.
That's the algorithm?
That's the algorithm, absolutely. I mean, and it's getting confusing because as I was hearing, I was thinking, oh my God, everything is algorithm, like everything is design. You know, it becomes this gigantic catch-all word that becomes even more undefined as we go. But before we get to that, your presentation was fantastic because it really touches upon one of the topics that I'm sure we're all itching to talk about tonight. So we heard a lot of type. You know, my husband always says that he likes to play with stereotypes, sometimes in a very politically incorrect way, because stereotypes contain a lot of truth, which is absolutely right. But we've seen that algorithms help us create stereotypes, phenotypes, patterns, and ultimately lead us to profiling and can lead us into believing in truths that are more fabricated than actual. So let's talk about bias, as we've all wanted to do since the beginning. So since humans are biased and humans make and use algorithms, how do we protect ourselves from believing that there's truth and objectivity in the algorithm? Just a little question. Easy, easy. Who wants to start?
Everybody's looking at me?
Yeah, I'm looking at you because you're in my line of sight. But no, but you've addressed that too, and you're the one that said you wanted to talk about bias.
I think the question of bias is really fascinating because it originates on two sides of the equation. It is on the one side the human that creates the algorithm and preconception, as you talked about, in terms of categories that have been established historically to put people into. On the other hand, that was the side I was trying to get to, is as algorithms take on this life of their own and learn from their environment, they are picking up biases of the data that is fed to them. They turn to represent what they have seen in the data they were exposed to. And at that point, it could be objective but undesirable. It might be a reflection of social truths that we may not really appreciate, or it could be manipulated by me as the feeder who decides what data it should be exposed to in its quest, as well as what is the criteria it's trying to optimize. And it is nearly impossible, to my understanding, to expose when everything is said and done and the algorithm drops out at the bottom that now scores everything and sorts your news feed, to translate back what the origin of the bias was. And I really like the point brought up here. As much as I love machine learning and predictive modeling, and maybe because I do, I don't trust my models ever. I know that there's a huge difference between a prediction and truth, and even data and truth. Typically, my experience has been, when people talk about dirty data, it's just you don't understand what the data means. It's our misinterpretation of what we are being told. I think this is the third source of bias, is our interpretation of outcomes of models as we then fall back into cultural buckets, whereas maybe the model wasn't quite as sure and even told you there the fact that it didn't really know, but we can't process that uncertainty in an unbiased way when we interact with the results of algorithms.
Mm-hmm. So maybe it also has to do, you know, Adam, you were talking about trying to advocate for a deeper literacy of the function of X. And it seems like, once again, it's about, you know, there's people who are in the know and there's people that instead are recipients of what gets studied and are recipients of the use of algorithms and of the kind of mythology of algorithms. This literacy of the function of X, does it mean to make people aware and beware of the way algorithms are presented?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably varying degrees of import on that literacy. So we would hope that the sort of practitioners of algorithm design and sort of manufacture would themselves have the healthy skepticism of the conversation that we're having now. And so I would sort of imbue the literacy of what we would want those practitioners to have with this kind of sense of angst about bias, for example. It then goes one step further, that if a decision maker is ultimately relying on the output of an algorithm to make a certain decision, then the manner in which the confidence of that output, acknowledging that none of these things are taking us to truth, they're taking us kind of asymptotally closer to something like it, is exposed to them, and that's part of their literacy, right? So that they imbue their decision with the appropriate degree of skepticism or confidence. And then, of course, there's just all of us in our kind of consumption of media and our consumption of recommendations and our sort of choices of where we go and what we consume and so on and so forth. I think to the extent that we feel like the result that we're being exposed to, in this case sort of a recommendation, is itself purely kind of perfunctory, that it was the result of a kind of purely mechanical, sterile process, I think to some extent that will affect our interaction with it. And the more we become aware of the recommendations we might get, the more we get recommendations, essentially, the more we are exposed to the results of algorithms, the more we will see variability in the nature and quality and texture of those outputs. And I think that will also become a part of our literacy. And we might start to value algorithms differently and different types of algorithms, and we might seek transparency into who is behind, who's sort of in the box, effectively, as part of our literacy. So I think those are sort of different dimensions and different requirements based on who's doing it and who's being exposed to it and what kind of action is taken as a result of it.
I very much like, Heather, how art is taking its role by the horns, really, by becoming a mirror to what's happening, and what you're doing in particular, I think is incredibly interesting. So the evolution that we've seen is maybe quite typical of the introduction of a new technology. The algorists of the beginning really believing and loving the machine and trying to see what comes of it, and then more emotional inputs and more emotional uses. And now this idea of really using the algorithm as a way to critique society and to alert to possible dangers. Do you see that happening in your work? It's so preeminent, and in Zach Blass also. Yeah. Do you see it happening in many other artists' work and designers?
Well, I certainly want to encourage more people to work in that way. I think, so I think a lot of work that takes place today is still in that algorist phase of celebrating the algorithm. I do think that there is a small movement of people who are thinking more critically about algorithms and using art as a tool to really deconstruct this stuff. I mean, certainly we see this in social sciences, right, that thinkers are looking at algorithms in society and pulling these things apart. So I think art has a really amazing role to play there. I don't think it, I haven't seen as much work in that vein as I would like to see, although I think Zach is a great example.
That's right for an exhibition.
So yeah, I mean, I would love to promote that. And I just wanted to comment also, I mean, on sort of, Adam, what you were saying, and thinking about transparency, because there's a lot of agendas at play here, right? And who wants transparency, right? And whose agenda is that, and how can we actually enable that? Because if you look at the DNA phenotyping example, there's really strong incentives on the part of the user, being the police, not to have transparency because the algorithms have biases that they're comfortable with. We want that objectivity, right? We want to believe that this is the truth. And so the users of these things generally, or I think in some cases or often, want to believe in that kind of objectivity that is attributed to the algorithm.
So interesting. We have to just take the algorithm as a mythological figure down a few notches. Huh?
I think really just pulling it apart, like really trying to deconstruct it.
It's a tool. You're completely right. Hugo, because of the nature of your work, and this might be a stereotype or it might be a mistake. Well, let me rephrase. Yeah, I don't know how to make questions in English anymore. Anyway, because of the nature of your work, is the feedback loop even more important? you know, the feedback loop that we were saying about adjusting, you know, for introducing the error, introducing the, not the serendipity, that's a little too romantic, but kind of making adjustments to the algorithm to reflect reality in a closer way. Do you do that a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as Claudia said that she didn't trust her models, you have to always have a healthy skepticism when you are developing an algorithm, and to not worship it. It's easy to worship something that is so cold and cool and has so much power, but especially when you're trying to, like I am, interested in uncovering some truth. And I don't ever try to confuse like what I found with what actually is, as that old adage says, you know, the map is not the territory.
Right. But what's the weirdest thing? I mean, the arugula thing was fun, and peanut butter too, but what's the weirdest finding you've ever encountered?
Not so much weird, but it's eerily accurate, is I was, a while back, there was news that the credit card companies were trying to predict divorce, because they noticed that if you were on your way to getting divorced, you would more likely default on your credit card balance. And so I looked at data to see if I could predict behaviorally on predisposition for divorce, and I found something that had very, very high predictive power. But I won't discuss it here, but if you want to know about it later, we'll talk about it.
Oh,
So
I would like to, since you know about this, sorry, this is kind of a little vacuous, but beauty companies, cosmetics companies use algorithm a lot, right?
what's that?
Cosmetics companies use algorithms
Everyone,
a lot, like
yeah.
when they discontinue my favorite color of foundation, right? Sometimes
Yes.
I would like
For
that
merchandising,
transparency to
yes.
happen.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah.
Before I open to the floor, I just have one question that I want to ask, because I was so fascinated by the idea of the meta-algorithm and learning algorithms. Are learning algorithms the same as deep learning? You know, let me tell you, deep learning definition is a branch of machine learning based on a set of algorithms that attempt to model high-level abstractions in data by using model architectures. They try to basically learn from.
So deep learning is a subset of such meta-algorithms. It is one of the most recent developments that are, I would say, most capable for a certain type of problem. They are not the universal solution to all our problems and shouldn't be worshipped any more than any of the other ones, but they fall into the category and toolbox of algorithms that learn and as a result produce things that are themselves smaller algorithms that you can use to predict, to make decisions, and so on.
Like fireworks almost. I think of like Chinese fireworks that you worked on Watson at IBM. Is Watson based on deep learning or only partly on it?
Watson was not specifically based on deep learning. So Watson, the technology that played Jeopardy, has a lot of understanding, and I put understanding in quotes, of language. Human language is very structured. There's a lot of linkage that ultimately we perceive as meaning, but can be discovered by machines as structure. And Watson is a combination of incredible hardware that was fast enough to put all of this into a room and accessible, the ability to parse human language from original documents. So it was not a huge database. It had Wikipedia pages in there, blogs, news stories, all of that in semi-original form. The layer that learned, the back end that I would consider a meta-algorithm, was again a machine that played thousands of Jeopardy games. It was going through every game known to mankind, and it had the current Watson produce hypotheses of what the answer is, and looked up what the truth was. And basically said, nope, you got this one wrong. Go and change the weighting of the evidence according to this, and try again. So there was this meta-algorithm at the end that helped estimating the confidence of which of the many things Watson could possibly come back with as an answer actually had validity. So it was estimating the reliability of the answer.
By the way, there's a Cook with Watson. I mean, there's a cookbook by Watson. It's like the idea is that one of the applications is that you tell Watson what's in the fridge and it gives you the recipe. And I was given a cookbook, so there you go. So now I'm going to open up to.
But how awesome that burrito is allegedly not so good.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Right?
I know.
Beautiful somehow.
It's the imperfection in the system that is the best part of it, the vulnerability. So I'm going to start. No, you're too close. I'm going to come back to you. So over there, I cannot see you, but you have a beard, I think. Yeah, there. Is that Aaron?
No, it's Alan.
Hi.
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 On the level of an interface, what does this literacy look like? I mean, how do we go from you might like to actually being involved in or knowing what your fine tuning is? You know, you put input, but what does it look like to be part of the map or see the map change in increments when you do that? I mean, is anyone doing this on the interface level?
So, I mean, in some of our recent experiences, we've been collaborating. In the case of what I showed, we were collaborating with some brilliant designers at RGA on efforts at kind of incorporating your gesture, your interaction into how we were initially kind of training our models and into the sort of recommendation experience to kind of overcome cold start at the beginning of any recommendation experience. So it can be in sort of onboarding into these kinds of things where you know nothing about somebody. So this is the sort of traditional problem called cold start. You know nothing about somebody and you can't go through the process of asking them 1,000 questions. So there's a really beautiful question for design of how do you sort of maximize the input that you can capture from that few seconds with them. And so that really every aspect of their interaction with some interface contributes to how you're sort of seeding your understanding of them. The other sort of facet of it is we think about is on the interaction design front when we're exposing the either facets of an algorithm, so it might be weights of things or relationships of things or whatever the sort of mathematical aspect is, to those who might affect it, tune it. And in our case, we like to think about sort of the model of the domain experts who for a long time have had that ownership of the record store, have had that ownership of the sommelier who gives you the great wine recommendation. And the design problem is effectively how do you kind of expose what is affecting the output to them so that they can most intuitively affect aspects of the algorithm or actually the results themselves. But of course, to try to do this at scale. So those are at least two dimensions of design that our teams and our collaborators think about when it comes to sort of the design problem.
Over there, last row, or almost last row.
Great panel.
Can you introduce yourself? It's
Hi, I'm
nice.
Fred. I work at Kickstarter. I build algorithms there and thought a lot about this. I wonder what part of the conversation about truth is really just a confusion about what we mean by truth and objectivity. I don't want to get too semantic, but the idea that like an algorithm can be correct if it can predict a little bit about the future or what your preference is or that kind of thing. And we may be confused when we call that truth, but it's not really truth. It's just something that like it predicted properly. And I wonder what part of our discomfort with algorithms stems from the fact that we're a little confused by something that's a little bit better than human intelligence in a very specific way, and we're a little bit intimidated by it. And I wonder if that's kind of an opportunity for
Good
challenging
question.
it and
Who wants to take
criticizing it.
Better how?
Well, for particular context, right? Like it did in fact predict that you were about to predict default on your credit card score when the human couldn't have done that. And like in that particular way, it's not objectively true, but it's like it's better than what a fellow human might do.
Well, I don't know that we have the human comparison. I mean, was a human sitting there looking at the same data?
Possibly, I mean, banks have done that for decades.
I don't know. I kind of question. I question the idea that the algorithm is necessarily better than the human at these things.
Hold on. We need the mics, because otherwise it's too hard to.
That's a great point, though.
Yeah.
Weather.
Do you think the algorithm is better has better taste than a human when it comes to music?
Well, go ahead.
I don't think it's, yeah, I mean, I mean, ours does. Again, I think that's the problem with sort of abstracting it into sort of capital A algorithm. It's not the algorithm, right? It's
like
the algorithm designed by those guys, tuned by those guys, affecting you at this moment, and having some, it being optimized for this particular circumstance produced a result which was actually quite delightful according to a human. Then, the algorithm produced something worthwhile. Obviously, to make this scientific, we'd want to appropriately contrast it with what the human would present at that moment. So it's hard to sort of say. I think to that broader point, though, which isn't really just about the comparative analysis, I don't think any of us would advocate any of this is achieving truth. I certainly wouldn't advocate, or even aspire to that. I think the beauty is that
Yeah, what's true?
yeah.
we're just
No, that
trying to
was
get
his
as close as we
question.
can
It's
to
very
something like
interesting.
it. Yeah.
So the weather was brought up. Do you want to say anything
So
about the
the
weather?
example, I think that was a instantiation of the earlier question. I think we have made great progress in predicting the weather better today than we used to maybe 20 years ago, when it was indeed people sitting over whatever kind of information. So I don't think we have to have a debate of science versus religion, which is almost where this seems to be going, in the sense there are things that are objectively true and will happen tomorrow, and that can be assessed tomorrow with whether or not they happened. And the reality is, when it comes to those things, algorithms tend to be better at predicting them, almost surely, given that you can have data around it. I wouldn't enter this argument. I think there's a completely second question. This is not all that there is to the world. Not everything in the world is about predicting things. And this is where the notion of the role of the algorithm is a very different one. I want to come back to truth, and my observation is more of a human cognitive bias. People just can't deal with probabilities. Even I myself just can't do it. We have this lens model of how people, if you tell them the probability is 80%, oh, it will happen. It's just the mental, it just flips over to determinism. And at the same time, I'm observing that people are a lot more critical, because people might be wrong, that's fine. But if the model says it was X, and then it turns out it wasn't, although the model didn't say it was X, the model says that there's a chance that it's X, you only remember that the model said it was X, and therefore the algorithm, Demby, he is wrong. So there is a very different way of processing these predictions, which comes back to a cognitive bias of how we ingest them. And really, we have to flip the discussion, in my opinion, not so much is the algorithm right or wrong, but what kind of behaviors and decisions does it lead to? And there's where the biases come to haunt us, if they are used by the police to fall back into stereotyping. The algorithm was probably not entirely wrong in the way it described the information extracted from the DNA. But when it then falls into, and here is the stereotype that the police officer sees when he looks at the picture, when we fall back into the problems of the uses. And that's where we have to be very critical.
Mm-hmm. And also in terms of what kind of systems of power are being shored up, right? And like, who is benefiting from this algorithm?
Yeah, it's working, don't worry.
Okay. Hi, I'm David from New Lab, and I have two questions I'm going to sneak in.
One, pick one. There are too many people.
Okay. So I guess for Adam and for Hugo, I've always, heard different rationalizations of what good algorithms can do, and you said something really interesting, that you're trying to create truth and self-actualization, or the ability for people to be self-actualized through understanding their data. And I'd like to just contrast that with the idea that, it feels like, particularly when you're talking about shopping and predictive behavior, that you're really, if you put an iPhone 6 sale in front of somebody Friday at lunch and you do it 1 million times, a certain number of those people will buy it from their computer. So the question is it really self-actualization, or is it just like more discursive discourse around the act of manipulating people to think they want something?
Get this, Hugo.
I think my media trainer says that's a loaded question. But yeah, media algorithm media trainer. But I think there's optimizing for sales, and maybe we do too much of optimizing for sales. But one trend you see in a lot of e-commerce sites is they see that that's too short term. That really in the intermediate term, longer term, you want to optimize for engagement. And I was at eBay until this year, and I know that eBay is very interested in optimizing for even better things like becoming an influencer and helping to educate and teach consumers something. And I think all tech companies and media companies will want some mind share in being an educator. And so I think these goals are shifting away from maybe what you say, like just trying to make a dollar, into something that would be longer term as a goal. And also, I'm just very interested in, and what I meant by self-actualization was, I'm really interested in, we talk about algorithms as a black box. But really, I'm using algorithms, and I hope that you were able to see some of that, as walking into the murky unconscious of society and turning on the light and trying to illuminate and make transparent the structures of identity and maybe of politics and other things. And I think that it's a critical practice, and I think there's a huge movement toward critical practices in algorithms to help us to understand ourselves better.
And it's really interesting because one could use a counter algorithm by seeing that map and trying to go against the grain. So yeah, over here, please, Shayna. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alexis from the New York Times R&D Lab. I've been thinking a lot about, there's a lot of talk about transparency in terms of algorithms as a solution, and I've been thinking a lot more from a design perspective in terms of legibility, because transparency is the idea that you can kind of open everything up and that it will become understandable, which I think is a false premise. So Adam, you touched on this a little bit, but I've been trying to think about like if there's a way to generalize or standardize the aspects of an algorithmic system that you reveal to a user that make it most legible, that create the best balance between sort of understandability and information and detail?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know that there's, I think that would be a worthwhile endeavor for us to kind of, as a community, collectively work towards. I would say that there's a precedent, and if you think about sort of scientific imagery, that it too is a degree removed from the subject that was being observed, and in photographing it, right, in doing something to it before it gets published, there has been a whole movement towards how do we reveal back, at least to the scholarly community, what has been done to it, so at least you have a sense of transparency in that case into whatever manipulation or transformation has happened. I think we can probably imagine a kind of similar or sort of an analog here in a mathematical sense, and so it would mean somewhat abstracting the kinds of things one could do into things that we could then communicate very explicitly to a general audience. I think it's a very sort of doable and interesting kind of construct. I think transparency is critical for some, and legibility is important for others, and that'll be a function of context and value of decision and criticality of decision.
I want to take a very quick one on this, because I feel there is a misunderstanding of, or it's one thing to understand what the algorithms right now is. I mean, you can probably understand why Amazon recommended this book to you right now. Or not why in the sense of what your data led to it, but you don't know how it came to the conclusion that this current version of the algorithm is the optimal one, and how everybody else's behavior has led to that version that right now makes that recommendation to you. And I'm not entirely sure, and that's probably an offline conversation, how transparency comes back to that feedback loop of how everybody else's behavior is ultimately encapsulated in what it's doing for you.
So do you think it's more about creating transparency around the values or assumptions that went into the design of the system?
I think that's part of it, but I still don't think it's sufficient to gain full understanding to the where this recommendation truly originated. There's a simple answer. It was 3.7 times your gender plus 1.2 times your location. I don't know what else. What you don't know, why the hell 3.7?
Yeah.
And this, I don't even know how to tell you.
And didn't you say specifically that the Beats music wanted to be magic?
Yeah, so I think part of, I mean, that's a really interesting question, is that in some cases, I think it's worth thinking about contexts where explaining why something resulted the way it resulted it limits the experience in some way, right? If we're thinking about culture. So,
Maybe you just want to know that it happened. You want to be aware that there's been a procedure.
Probably in some cases, but again, I think it probably is contextually dependent, right? Sometimes you really don't want to know, and you do want to kind of just have that.
Well, it's like a prestidigitator, right? You want to know, you know that there's a trick, but you want to be surprised nonetheless, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so then do you want the transparency into the trick, or do you want the sort of just go home at the end and ponder it? So I think that you know, it's different if you're going to have, this is why you should have this drug, right? And this is why you should have this surgery, is different than, this was a beautiful wine. Right? So I think the context actually matters quite significantly here.
Well, one thing that definitely would help here would be if we taught kids programming, right? I mean, the more people that actually know how to code, the more they can interact with coded systems and decode them.
There's also, I learned about this today, this Parliament Counts in the UK. Do you know about this? This is pretty extraordinary, that parliamentarians are being urged to sign up to take a workshop in statistics if they're elected to the
Parliament counts. I like it.
Okay.
It's so beautiful.
Such a sort of extraordinary notion.
So there's a question. And I want to tell you, if we end up without time, please email me the questions. You have my email address. So yeah, you'll get a lot of questions afterwards. No, but truly we'll do that because there are so many people that would like to know. Please go ahead.
Hi, Gavin. I work at NASA Goddard, and I work on climate and weather models.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that you were dancing around are things that within the modeling community in science, have been relevant for many decades. The notion of skill, that a model can be useful even though it's not true. The notion of bias, that despite the fact that it's skillful, it can still be systematically wrong in many different respects. And the notion of contestability. Whenever you're putting an algorithm out there that's going to affect somebody's decision, if it's an important decision, it's going to be contested because there's a lot of other things that are going on that might mean that people don't want that decision to be made, or they do want that decision to be made, but for other reasons.
So you
for other
think that
reasons.
algorithms are very vulnerable?
So the process of doing algorithms makes you vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so, I work in a very politically contested area, and we try and help people understand what we do, but people really, really want it to be objective and true and telling them exactly what the right answer is. So the question is, how do you recognize the contestability of all of the outputs of your algorithms when they come to the point where people are actually making decisions based on them that actually matter to people?
Oh, right. This is a pretty good question, too. Who wants to take it?
Well, I mean, I have this beef, too, I think, if I understand your question correctly, is that algorithms are hard to contest, and people expect them to be just true all the time. And if a person, if a cop pulls me over for speeding, I can ask them, like, officer, really? What was I doing wrong? But then if it was a traffic light, one of those, a camera police things that just sends you a ticket in the mail, you really have very little recourse. And if algorithms are driven by machine learning, that's even more problematic because exposing the algorithm is not enough. There's also all of the training examples that went in. It's not really possible. And we know that being able to inquire and interact with something, to debug something, is very, very important. An old adage for programmers is that you can only debug at the complexity, half the complexity at which you write code, right? So we can't debug any of these algorithms that come out of maybe the results of machine learning training very easily. And so it's very important to I don't know, maybe we'll have a rights movement against algorithms
I know, I
or
was
something,
thinking about it.
right?
Oh, just like an awareness, like a campaign for awareness, algorithm.
Right,
awareness
or we'll
campaign.
need algorithm whistleblowers to tell us
Yeah.
that that weight was 3.2, right?
Well,
so
it's hacking and
Yeah.
reverse engineering and finding exploits.
And
That's
then the
our
algorithm
contestability.
lovers, you know,
Yeah.
you can have, let's actually take action. Yeah, I'm gonna take one and two, first you, and then I'm gonna come to you.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm just an accountant. So you're all dealing with very large, deep data sets. What happens when that big data set is taken away? And how would your work change if your algorithm was forced to build its own data set or just rely on the very little amount of data that it could collect in the moment that it executes?
Conceptual art for real.
Yeah, I have
Heather,
a good
go
answer
for it.
to that to start with. So, I mean, one way that this is really visible, I think, so if you look at systems that generate faces based on data, the more different kinds of faces that they look at, the more kinds of faces they can create, right? So if you saw that slide where I had like the 10 example scans, they were all white people, right? So that system, if that system is looking at those 10 images of people's faces, the only faces that system's ever going to make are going to be white people. So it's kind of like really blunt and clear cut, I think, in that instance.
I mean, sometimes I would say we're just turning back time. I mean, in the old days, there were these rules. You know, if the sky is red in the morning, that's bad weather, and that's what we're going to be back to. If you really switch off all the sensors and all the things that would collect us weather data that help us project tomorrow, I feel we will basically come back to the level of prediction we used to do. And music recommendation will be me calling up my buddy, hey, have you heard anything good recently? And I just have to pick which buddy because I know that that's the one who has similar music taste to mine. So I don't think you can substitute real data with data you make up yourself or no data. I think you just have to change the decision process back to where it was.
But what happens if we make the algorithm intuitive? So we give it experience, but it doesn't have that data, like what a human.
For me, experience is data in the sense you feed it in form of facts into it, or you just hard code what the algorithm does. So I'm having a hard time seeing that distinction.
Okay. Over. Oh, you have it already. Okay.
I don't think. Oh. My name is Matt. I'm from the School for Poetic Computation. So I have a question related to the trolley experiment, which is a philosophical thought experiment where you have a trolley driver. It's a runaway train, and it can either hit 5 people or turn to another track and hit 1. And this is actually really relevant now as we think about like driverless cars and autonomous vehicles, where you're actually going to write a program that might, or an algorithm that might make that decision. So I'm just curious about kind of like moral implications within algorithms.
We already have economics that calculates the value of a human life, right? So perhaps that algorithm will calculate which lives are the most valuable.
And who's going to input the data that makes those? I mean, because now what we've learned tonight is that ultimately the algorithm is a tool. So who's input the data that allows the algorithm to decide which life is more valuable?
Exactly.
I would venture to say that there are decisions that, even those that are sort of imbued with morality or questions of morality, where we do have we probably can reduce some of those questions, and we probably can look to precedent, and we probably can look to things that are quantifiable, and we probably can even, in some cases, set certain parameters, and then we, as long as we have transparency that was how that judgment was made, or that was how it will be made in that circumstance, then it's not sort of a runaway algorithm, right? It's something where we have, as long as we have transparency into it and we understand the method that went into what will happen at the moment of a decision, I'm not sure I don't necessarily see the problem. I think there's probably questions where it's a kind of question that we couldn't anticipate, and so those are the really hard questions, right? And so those are questions like, we elect presidents to make decisions that we don't know that will come in the next 4 years, but we hope we've sort of assessed certain things to affect that decision. But even that, to some extent, we could probably model out. So I think there's
trust, right?
There's trust. I mean, I guess there's trust. I guess there's trust in a person in that case. Maybe to some extent trust in a process. I mean, I feel like you could somehow unpack what are the things that contribute to that trust, even in that case.
Yeah, but, you trust the fact that a person implicitly has a moral compass, or you mistrust the moral compass, and instead maybe your question was, when something doesn't have a moral compass, how do you deal with it ultimately?
But do we feel like a president of the United States in the Situation Room, we have line of sight to that decision about going to war?
No.
Right? It's so many externalities. It's such a complex system. So I kind of question what would be the comparable sort of situation that we have in the real world for something like that.
How long before we replace the politicians with algorithms?
In the UK soon.
Well, listen, it's been a great night. And one of the things, we've learned a lot. Of course, we haven't, I hate the word unpack, but I have to start using it because it works. Like, okay, we have unpacked quite a bit. But ultimately, what I have learned personally is that an algorithm is a tool, and it starts with human beings. So if the juxtaposition is always between human bias and algorithms' objectivity, the truth is that, like any tool, there's no objectivity possible. There's only the way we use it. And the best thing that we can do is to disseminate as much as possible the awareness and possibly also the literacy about how algorithms work and what they do, so that people can treat them with the kind of distance or the kind of abandon and embrace that they deserve and need in any different situation. Well, that's just what I have unpacked, but I hope you also have your own ideas. And please do send me, because I know that there were so many questions left unanswered. I mean, we're going to go outside for a drink, but if you want, you feel free to email me. And I want to thank you because you were fantastic, and thank you very much also. And to be continued outside. Thank you.